December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. They called it the Lost Platoon. Around 100 men of the 28th Infantry Division, cut off and surrounded during the initial German onslaught of the Battle of the Bulge. For 3 weeks, they had ceased to exist on any official map. They were ghosts, stranded deep behind enemy lines, with no radio, no resupply, and no hope of rescue. The brutal cold was a more relentless enemy than the Germans. Hunger was a constant, gnawing ache in their bellies. They were down to their last few rounds of ammunition per man. Their uniforms were in tatters, and their bodies were racked with frostbite and exhaustion. They were watching their war end, one slow, freezing death at a time. Their prison was the forest. Their warden was the German 6th Panzer Army, and every single day, their salvation and their damnation rolled past them, less than a mile from their hidden camp. It was a road. The Germans called it Rollbahn C, a vital artery pumping the lifeblood of the offensive, fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements to the front. It was a serpent of steel and diesel, a never-ending convoy of Tiger tanks, half-tracks, and supply trucks, protected by roving patrols and machine gun nests hidden in the trees. To the starving men of the Lost Platoon, it was a vision of heaven and hell combined, an endless buffet they could not touch. Attacking the convoy was suicide. A single platoon with a handful of bullets against an armored army, it was a laughable, insane idea. But as the days bled into weeks and the hunger became desperation, the insane started to look like the only logical option left. Their commander, a battle-hardened sergeant from the coal mines of Pennsylvania named Frank Rizzo, knew that if they did nothing, they would all be dead by Christmas. They had to cut the head off the snake. They had to hit the massive brain, central supply depot, that the convoy fed into, a place somewhere deep in the German rear that the GIs had nicknamed the Fortress. But how? How could a handful of ghosts possibly get inside the most heavily guarded place in the Ardennes? The answer came from the unlikeliest of soldiers, Corporal Leo Thorne. To the big, burly men of the platoon, he was a kid, a mascot. They called him Mighty Mouse. He was 17. He had lied about his age to enlist, and was so small and skinny that his uniform looked like it belonged to another man. He barely looked strong enough to carry his own rifle. But in the 3 weeks of their isolation, Leo had become the platoon's most valuable asset. He was born and raised in the deep woods of Appalachia, and the forest was more of a home to him than any city. He could move through the dense, snow-covered undergrowth without making a sound. He could read tracks, find shelter, and remain unseen when he was 10 feet away. He was the platoon's eyes and ears, the ghost who slipped out of their camp at night and returned at dawn with priceless intelligence on German patrols and movements. He was the reason they were still alive. The plan was born from one of Leo's scouting reports. He had discovered a German logging operation, less than 2 miles from their position. The Germans, desperate for firewood to combat the bitter cold, were clear-cutting sections of the forest, loading massive logs onto trucks and hauling them back to the depot to be distributed. And among the piles of timber, Leo had seen several large, hollow logs, their insides rotted out by time and decay. The idea, when Leo proposed it to Sergeant Rizzo, was met with stunned, horrified silence. It was not just a long shot. It was a suicide mission of the highest order. It was a modern-day Trojan Horse, but instead of a magnificent wooden statue, the vessel would be a muddy, hollow log. The plan was for Leo to crawl inside one of these logs, armed with as much explosive as he could carry. He would then wait for the Germans to unknowingly load him onto one of their trucks and drive him directly through the front gates of the fortress. Once inside, he would have one job: find the central ammunition and fuel dump, plant his charges, and turn Hitler's war machine into a raging inferno. One boy, inside a log, against an entire army. It was impossible. It was insane. It was their only hope. The preparation was a grim and silent ritual, performed in the frozen twilight of the deep forest. The men of the Lost Platoon worked with a desperate, focused energy. There were no illusions about what they were asking Leo to do. They were sending a boy to do a man's job, a job that would almost certainly kill him. Every man in the platoon, from Sergeant Rizzo down to the lowest private, had volunteered for the mission first. But they all knew the truth. Only Leo had the skills to get to the logging site undetected, and only Leo was small enough to fit inside the chosen log. He was the only man for the job, and the weight of that fact was a physical presence in their camp. They chose the log from a pile Leo had scouted earlier, a massive, gnarled piece of oak over 10 feet long and nearly 3 feet in diameter, with a dark, hollow core running its entire length. It was perfect. It was a coffin. They spent the day preparing Leo's payload. The platoon's sole demolitions expert, a corporal named Boomer Davies, carefully stripped apart the remaining landmines, grenades, and mortar shells, harvesting the precious explosives. He worked with the delicate precision of a watchmaker, his hands raw from the cold, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He packed the unstable TNT and Composition B into canvas sacks, rigging them with timers made from cheap wristwatches and simple electrical detonators powered by scavenged batteries. He created a daisy chain of death, a web of interconnected charges designed to create a single, massive, sympathetic detonation. The final package was a crude but terrifyingly effective instrument of destruction, powerful enough to level a city block. As he worked, he explained the mechanism to Leo in a low, calm voice, going over the arming sequence again and again. The red wire to the red terminal, the black wire to the black, he repeated, his eyes locking with Leo's. You get 30 minutes from the second you connect that last wire. No more, no less. 30 minutes to get clear. You understand me, kid? 30 minutes. As night fell, a small team led by Sergeant Rizzo escorted Leo to the edge of the German logging site. The air was thick with the smell of pine and diesel, and the sound of German voices drifted through the trees. They watched as the German work crew, a sullen group of conscripts and older soldiers, finished loading the last of the day's timber onto a large Opel Blitz truck. It was now or never. Rizzo gripped Leo's shoulder, his hand surprisingly gentle. You do not have to do this, son, he said, his voice a low rumble. There's no shame in walking away. Leo just looked at him, his young face pale, but his eyes steady and clear. Who else is going to do it, Sarge? He asked simply. He was not just a boy from Appalachia anymore. He was a soldier. He was the platoon's last, desperate gamble. With a final, silent nod, Leo slipped away into the darkness, a ghost in the trees. The men watched him go, every one of them feeling a profound and terrible sense of guilt, as if they were sacrificing one of their own to appease a merciless god. Getting to the log pile was the easy part. Leo moved with the quiet grace of a predator, his small frame melting into the shadows. He reached the stack of freshly cut timber, the smell of sawdust sharp in the cold air. The hollow log was on the top of the pile, a dark, gaping mouth waiting to swallow him. He took one last look at the stars, a final, fleeting glimpse of the vast, open world. Then, taking a deep breath, he shimmied into the log's dark, claustrophobic embrace. The space was tighter than he had imagined. The rough, splintered wood tore at his uniform. The air was thick with the smell of rot and damp earth. It was like being buried alive. He lay there, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, as the German soldiers approached. He heard their boots crunching in the snow. He heard them laughing and complaining, in a language he did not understand. And then he felt the world shift as they began to roll his log toward the truck. The journey to the fortress was a special kind of hell. He was tossed and thrown with every bump in the frozen, rutted road. The darkness was absolute, a disorienting, suffocating void. The only thing that kept him sane was the thought of his mission, the feel of the heavy sacks of explosives packed around him, and the rhythmic ticking of the wristwatch timer in his pocket, a sound only he could hear. After what felt like an eternity, the truck slowed and then stopped. He heard voices, a gate creaking open, and then the truck rumbled forward again. He was in. He was inside the fortress. The truck made several more stops, dropping off logs at various locations within the sprawling depot. Finally, it came to a halt. and he heard the Germans preparing to unload the last of their cargo, which included his log. He braced himself as his log was unceremoniously rolled off the truck, crashing to the frozen ground with a bone-jarring thud. He lay there, dazed and bruised, listening as the truck drove away. The first part of the plan was a success. He was a Trojan horse, delivered to the heart of the enemy's kingdom. Now, all he had to do was wait for the one thing he had in abundance: darkness, and the silence that came with it. The hours Leo spent inside that log were a slow, creeping torture that tested the limits of his sanity. The cold, which had been a constant companion for weeks, now felt like a physical entity, a predator slowly draining the life from him. His body ached from the brutal journey, and the cramped space gave him no room to stretch or shift his weight. The darkness was a living thing, pressing in on him, filling his mind with phantoms. Every sound from outside the log was amplified, distorted. The crunch of a guard's boots sounded like an approaching giant. The distant clang of metal on metal was a gunshot. He had to fight against the primal urge to scream, to claw his way out. He focused on his breathing, slowing it down, mimicking the hibernating animals of his Appalachian home. He thought about his mission, about the faces of the men in his platoon, counting on him. He was not Leo Thorne, the scared 17-year-old kid. He was a weapon, waiting for the moment to be deployed. As the deep, impenetrable black of a moonless night finally settled over the depot, the sounds of the bustling camp began to die down. The symphony of engines and shouting men was replaced by the lonely cry of the wind and the rhythmic tramp of sentries on their rounds. It was time. With agonizing slowness, Leo began his escape. He pushed himself backward, his uniform snagging on splinters, his muscles screaming in protest. Inch by agonizing inch, he slid out of the log's suffocating embrace, emerging into the freezing night air like a creature reborn. He lay flat on the ground for a full 5 minutes, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness, his senses expanding to taste the air, to feel the vibrations in the ground. He was back in his element. The fortress was just a different kind of forest. Its trees were stacks of crates, its rivers were muddy tracks, and its predators were men in gray uniforms. His first objective was to find the heart of the beast, the main ammunition and fuel dump. Boomer Davies had been clear. Hitting a barracks or a motor pool would be a nuisance. Hitting the ammo and fuel would be a decapitating strike. Leo began to move, a shadow among shadows. He did not walk, he flowed, melting from one dark patch to another, his movements economical and silent. He climbed over massive stacks of artillery shells, their metal casings cold as ice under his gloved hands. He crept past hangars where mechanics worked under dim lights on the engines of Panther tanks, the smell of oil and hot metal thick in the air. He slipped by guard posts, holding his breath as German sentries passed just feet away, their faces illuminated for a moment by the glow of a cigarette, their conversations about home and wives a surreal counterpoint to his deadly purpose. The depot was a city dedicated to war, and he was its only saboteur. He found it in the most heavily guarded sector of the entire compound. It was not a single building, but a vast, sprawling field of death. On one side were pyramids of wooden crates, stacked 30 feet high, containing millions of rounds of small arms ammunition, artillery shells, and Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. On the other side was the fuel dump. Hundreds upon hundreds of 55-gallon drums were stacked like cordwood, a lake of high-octane gasoline that was the lifeblood of the 6th Panzer Army. The two sections were separated by a hastily built earthen berm, a laughably inadequate attempt at safety. The entire area was surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire and overlooked by 4 machine gun towers. It was the most dangerous place in the Ardennes, and it was beautiful. Leo felt a cold, fierce thrill. This was the spot. This was the place where he would light a fire that would be seen all the way to Berlin. Getting inside the fenced-in area was the next challenge. The patrols were frequent, their patterns disciplined. He watched them for nearly an hour, memorizing their routes, timing their intersections. He found a blind spot, a small section of the fence momentarily obscured from the towers by a tall stack of crates. He had a window of exactly 90 seconds between patrols. It was barely enough time. When the moment came, he moved. He did not run. He sprinted, his small body a blur of motion. He reached the fence, his wire cutter snipping through the cold, taut wire with a series of dull, metallic clicks. He slithered through the opening, the barbs tearing at his jacket, and flattened himself in the shadow of a mountain of gasoline drums. He was inside the powder keg. He paused, his heart hammering, listening. No alarms, no shouts. He was still a ghost. He unslung the heavy canvas sacks of explosives. The ticking of the wristwatch in his pocket seemed to grow louder, a frantic countdown to destiny. He looked at the vast field of fuel and ammunition, a forest of pure destructive potential. Now, he just had to plant the seeds. The heart of the German war machine was a surprisingly quiet place. The only sounds inside the compound were the whisper of the wind and the faint, clomb, rhythmic hum of a generator somewhere in the distance. For Leo, it was like being in a cathedral of destruction. He moved with a reverence that bordered on stealth, his small frame dwarfed by the monolithic stacks of ordnance. His target was not just one spot, but three. Boomer Davies' plan was built on a cascade of fire, a chain reaction that would ensure nothing survived. The first charge had to go in the fuel dump, the second in the artillery shell depot, and the third, the linchpin, had to be placed on the massive pile of Panzerfaust rockets, which would act as a massive secondary booster, scattering fire and destruction across the entire depot. He started with the fuel. Creeping between the tightly packed rows of gasoline drums, he found what he was looking for. A section where the barrels were stacked high and unstable. A single, powerful blast here would rupture hundreds of them at once, creating an atomized cloud of fuel vapor that would be massively explosive. He gently placed the first canvas sack, packed with 10 pounds of high explosive, into a gap between the drums, nestling it like an egg in a nest. He ran the detonator wire, his fingers numb and clumsy in the cold, taping it securely to the side of a drum. Every movement was slow, deliberate. A single spark from a static charge, a single clumsy scrape of metal on metal, could incinerate him where he stood. He was a priest performing a deadly sacrament, and his every motion filled with a terrible, focused grace. Next, the artillery shells. He crossed the earthen berm, a shadowy no-man's land separating the liquid fire from the solid, and entered the forest of wooden crates. The sheer scale of it was staggering. There were enough shells here to level a city. He knew from Boomer's instruction that a simple explosion might just scatter the crates. He needed to crack them open, to expose the high explosive filler of the shells themselves to the ensuing fire. He found a key structural point where several massive stacks leaned against each other, creating a load-bearing junction. He wedged his second, larger charge deep into the intersection of the crates, a cancer in the heart of the woodpile. If this charge went off as planned, it would bring the entire pyramid down, shattering the crates and exposing their deadly contents. His final target was the Panzerfausts. The crude, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons were notoriously unstable, their propellant charges sensitive to shock and fire. A pile of several thousand of them, stacked carelessly in the open, was not just an arsenal, it was a volcano waiting for a reason to erupt. This was Boomer's masterstroke. The fuel would create the fire, the artillery shells would provide the massive concussion, but the Panzerfausts would be the engine of chaos, turning into thousands of unguided rockets, spreading the inferno to every corner of the fortress. Leo placed the last and largest charge at the base of the rocket pile. He worked with a feverish intensity now, the minutes ticking away in his mind. He connected the wires from all three charges to his simple wristwatch timer, a spiderweb of death converging on a single, cheap mechanism. His work was done. All that was left was to connect the final wire to the battery terminal. The moment he did that, the 30-minute countdown would begin. He paused, his hand hovering over the final connection. This was the point of no return. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He thought of Sergeant Rizzo's face. He thought of the hungry, the freezing men of the Lost Platoon, hidden in the forest, praying for a miracle. He was their miracle. With a firm, steady hand, he pressed the last wire onto the terminal. A tiny, almost invisible spark jumped from the connection. The timer was active. The clock was ticking. 30 minutes. Now he had to do the impossible all over again. Get out. He had to retrace his steps, slip past the guards, crawl back through the fence, and disappear into the forest before he brought hell down upon this place. His mission was not over. The deadliest part had just begun. The journey out was a descent into a nightmare of magnified senses. The 30-minute timer was not just in his pocket. It was a drumbeat in his blood, a frantic, screaming clock in his mind. Every second that passed was a second closer to his own annihilation. The leisurely, patient stealth of his entry was a luxury he could no longer afford. Now, speed was as important as silence. But speed was the enemy of stealth. Every rushed movement, every quickened breath, was a potential death sentence. It was a paradox, a razor's edge he had to walk. He slithered back through the wire fence, the barbs catching on his clothes, each snag feeling like a hand grabbing at him from the darkness. He was back in the main depot, a ghost with a deadline. He retraced his steps, moving along the darkest edges of the shadows. The depot, which had seemed quiet on his way in, was now alive with 1,000 potential threats. A truck engine turning over in the distance made him freeze, his heart leaping into his throat. A burst of laughter from a distant guardhouse sounded like an alarm. He saw a patrol coming, and instead of waiting for them to pass, he was forced to dive into a drainage ditch, the icy, foul-smelling water soaking him to the bone, the cold so intense it felt like fire. He lay there, submerged in filth, as the German soldiers walked by just feet above him, their casual conversation a surreal torture. He counted the seconds in his head. 22 minutes left. He waited for them to pass, then pulled his shivering body from the ditch and pressed on, the freezing water in his boots turning every step into a squelching misery. He reached the spot where his log lay, a dark, silent monument to the first part of his journey. For a wild, insane moment, he considered crawling back inside, waiting out the explosion in the belly of his wooden horse. But he knew it was a fantasy. The concussion would turn the log into splinters and him into pulp. His only hope was distance. He had to get beyond the depot's perimeter fence, back into the forgiving darkness of the forest. The main gate was an impossibility, manned by a half-dozen guards in a heated blockhouse. He sprinted towards the eastern perimeter, a long stretch of fence that bordered the deep woods. It was his only way out. 20 minutes. He found a section of the fence, shrouded in the deep shadow of a large warehouse. He pulled out his wire cutters, his hands shaking so violently from cold and adrenaline that he could barely work them. He fumbled a cut, the wire slipping with a loud twang that echoed in the silent night. He froze, every muscle in his body screaming. He was sure he had been heard. He flattened himself against the ground, waiting for the shout, the searchlight, the burst of machine gun fire. Nothing. The sound had been swallowed by the vast, uncaring night. He went back to work, his movements more frantic now, snipping through the wires with a desperate haste. 18 minutes. He finally made a hole big enough to crawl through and slipped out, back into the relative freedom of the trees. He was out of the compound. But he was not safe. He did not run. He flew. He abandoned all pretense of stealth and crashed through the undergrowth, his lungs burning, his legs pumping with a strength he did not know he possessed. Branches whipped at his face. Thorns tore at his clothes. He fell, scrambling back to his feet, his only thought to put distance between himself and the ticking time bomb he had left behind. He ran blindly, fueled by pure primal terror, his internal clock screaming at him. 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 4. He stumbled into a clearing and collapsed, his body finally giving out. He lay there, gasping for air, his heart feeling like it was going to explode. He knew he was still too close, but he could go no further. He crawled behind a large fallen tree, curled into a ball, and covered his head with his arms. He had done all he could. The rest was up to physics. He closed his eyes and waited for the end of the world. He counted down the final seconds in his head. 3, 2, 1. The world did not begin with a bang. It began with a tremor. A low, deep vibration that traveled from the soles of Leo's boots and up through his bones, as if the very bedrock of the earth was groaning in its sleep. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, he thought it was over, that the charges had been duds, that his entire suicidal journey had been for nothing. And then, the night ignited. There was no sound at first, just a silent, impossible flash of light that turned the black, starless sky into a brilliant, searing white. It was as if a second sun had been born on the horizon, a sun that bleached all color from the world and cast long, dancing shadows from every tree in the forest. Even with his eyes squeezed shut and his face buried in the snow, the light burned through his eyelids, a raw, physical presence. Then came the sound. It was not an explosion. That word is too small, too simple. It was a physical concussion, a solid wall of pressure that hit him like a tidal wave, lifting him off the ground and slamming him against the fallen tree. The air was punched from his lungs in a single, violent gasp. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening, soul-shattering crack, thump, roar that was felt more than it was heard. It was the sound of a mountain giving birth, of the sky itself being torn in half. He felt a wave of incredible heat wash over him, melting the snow around him in an instant. The sky turned from white to a pulsating, demonic orange as the fuel dump detonated in a massive, rolling fireball that climbed thousands of feet into the air, a mushroom cloud of pure, incandescent rage. It was a man-made apocalypse, a new, terrible dawn. And then the real chaos began. He heard the sound of the Panzerfausts cooking off, not as a single explosion, but as a continuous, terrifying roar, like 1,000 dragons shrieking at once. He peeked over his log and saw a vision from hell. Hundreds, then thousands, of rocket trails crisscrossed the fiery sky, arcing in every direction. They were unguided, wild, turning the fortress into a self-consuming slaughterhouse. Rockets slammed into barracks, tore through the motor pool, and scythed through the panicked German soldiers who were now running from the flames. The symphony of destruction was relentless. The initial roar was followed by a continuous, rolling thunder of secondary explosions. The artillery shells he had unstacked were now detonating in their own chain reaction, adding their deep, concussive bass notes to the hellish choir. The entire depot was gone. It had been erased from the face of the earth, replaced by a single, massive, churning column of fire and black smoke. Miles away, in the dark, frozen woods, the men of the Lost Platoon were woken by the ground shaking. They stumbled out of their makeshift shelters, their faces filled with confusion and fear, thinking it was an earthquake or a massive artillery barrage. Then they saw it. A new sun rising in the south, a vast, silent flash that lit up the entire forest, followed moments later by the colossal, rolling thunder of the explosion. They stared in stunned, reverent silence. Sergeant Rizzo stood apart from the others, his face illuminated by the distant inferno, tears freezing on his cheeks. "He did it," he whispered, his voice choked with a mixture of grief and profound, unbelievable pride. "The kid, he actually did it." They did not cheer. They did not shout. They simply stood there, 100 forgotten men, and watched the funeral pyre of the 6th Panzer Army burn against the night sky. It was a monument to the boy they had sent to do the impossible. Leo Thorne did not die. He was battered, bruised, half-deafened, and his uniform was scorched. But he was alive. As the sun began to rise, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of gray and pink, he slowly, painfully got to his feet. He looked back at the pillar of smoke that marked the grave of the fortress, and then he turned and began the long walk back to his platoon. He was no longer a boy. He was no longer a mascot. He was a ghost who had walked into the heart of the fire and had come back, leaving only ashes behind. He was the secret, the myth, the impossible victory that no one would ever read about in the history books. He was the hero of a battle that, officially, never happened.